Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this episode of the Brewery, I will be discussing a commander I've been playing for a long time, Brago King Eternal. Hopefully this deck piques your interest in how to play Brago. If you're a patron of the Commander Tavern, then chances are that you saw this brew earlier. Brago is a 2/4 spirit. I'm surprised he wasn't updated as a Spirit Noble, with flying for 2 generic, 1 white, and 1 blue. He has, whenever Brago King Eternal deals combat damage to a player, exile any number of target non-land permanents you control, then return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control. This is an insane ability, and I was lucky to pull him from a conspiracy pack because the moment he was spoiled, I knew I had to brew with him. Basically, anytime he connects with an opponent, you get to blink any of your non-land permanents in any combination. Since all the triggers enter the stack at the same time, you get to choose the order in which they resolve. That means that by planning accordingly, you can abuse triggers that could interact with each other. In order to abuse Brago's trigger, this is going to be somewhat odd deck tech. I brewed Brago without a single non-permanent in the deck. Some of you might be freaking out that there aren't any counterspells or Cyclonic Rift in the deck, but there are ways of getting these effects with non-land permanents. But I'll get into that soon enough. Another quirk about this deck is that there is a heavy synergy with the manifest mechanic, but that's something I'll get into greater detail in a moment. Since the deck is only running permanents, you might feel like the effects are going to be telegraphed, but not as often as you'd think. The deck is running Leyline of Anticipation and Winding Canyons. The Leyline gives flash to all our spells, but the Canyon only gives it to our creatures when we pay 2 and tap it. The land is great because it's not that easy to get rid of, and in a 2-colored deck, it isn't that much of a problem running a colorless mana source. You could also run Vidalcan Orrery if you so choose, in order to be even more redundant. Not only does this allow us to cast responses at instant speed, but also gives the deck an element of surprise. In order to further add to the element of surprise, the deck is like a morph deck, but without being a morph deck. When you flip over a card for its morph cost, it usually has an effect or ability when doing so. However, this is a blink deck, so the abilities trigger when the permanent enters the battlefield. And that's where manifesting your cards comes into the fold. When Brago blinks a face-down permanent, it returns to the battlefield face-up. So if, for example, you had a manifested Coveted Jewel, and then blink it with Brago, it'll return face-up to the battlefield. So its enter the battlefield trigger occurs, drawing you 3 cards. It also returns untapped, so you could also tap it to get mana. This is also an excellent way to cheat in really expensive cards. If you use Scroll of Fate to manifest something like Spine of Ishsa, you can then blink it in order to have it enter the battlefield, all for just tapping down Scroll of Fate. This saves you paying its mana cost. Another way to manifest cards at instant speed is with Mastery of the Unseen. It might cost 4 mana to activate, but you can do this at instant speed. Unlike Scroll of Fate, you're manifesting the top card of your library, and that's fine since you won't be manifesting any non-permanent card in this deck. Other ways of manifesting the top card of our library is with Cloud Form and Light Form. What's great about these spells is that they're auras, so they can be blinked with Brago, meaning that you can blink the manifested card as well as the aura in order to once more manifest the top card of our library. You can also include Primordial Mist for some more manifest shenanigans. Also, if you don't want to build a brew like this one that has no instants or sorceries, Primordial Mist can help you cast instants and sorceries that get manifested. One slight discomfort with manifesting the top card of your library is that you might not know what the top card is until you manifest it. Not to worry though, since the deck runs various brainstorm type effects. Scroll Rack switches cards in your hand with cards on the top of your deck. That way you can put the more expensive cards on top and keep the cheap ones in hand. Some actual straight up brainstorm effects come in cards like Jace the Mind Sculptor. You can use his 0 loyalty ability to literally brainstorm. The great thing about Brago is that he can blink Planeswalkers. That means that you can use that ability once again in the same turn after blinking him. You can also achieve brainstorm type effects by blinking Cavalier of Gales or Riverrise Augur. When these creatures enter the battlefield, you draw 3 cards and return 2 to the top of the deck. Even if you can't do this at instant speed for lack of having the appropriate cards or effects in play, it's still useful to be able to perform this action. That way you can manifest fatties in order to cheat them into play. Or maybe you want to ramp. Did I mention this deck is capable of ramping like crazy? If you manifest a bunch of lands, whether from your hand or the top of your library, when Brago blinks them as manifested creatures, they return to the battlefield as untapped lands. You can also ramp by blinking mana rocks. The deck runs Mana Crypt, Mox Amber, Mox Opal, Mana Vault, Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Thought Vessel, Thran Dynamo, and the aforementioned Coveted Jewel. You can tap these down during your pre-combat main phase in order to pay for abilities or cast spells. Then, if Brago connects with combat damage, you can blink them all in order for them to return untapped to the battlefield. You now have all that mana ready to use during your post-combat main phase or during any other player's turn. The reason I'm not running Crow Mox or Mox Diamond is because they get their ability depending on how they enter the battlefield. These Moxen are not worth blinking since you'd lose whatever was imprinted on Crow Mox and you'd have to once again discard a card with Mox Diamond. In their place, I'm running Thran Dynamo and Coveted Jewel since I can cheat them into play with Manifest, and they also provide 3 mana, which is nothing to scoff at either. Additionally, Coveted Jewel can draw us 3 cards when it enters the battlefield. You can also ramp into these rocks using Tesseret the Seeker. Not only can you use his -X ability to tutor up for a mana rock, but for other key artifacts in the deck as well. Additionally, his +1 can be used to untap artifacts. As with Jace, blinking him means being able to use his abilities twice in a turn. So you could potentially tutor for 2 mana rocks directly into play in the same turn. The deck also runs land-based ramp with Core Cartographer. Whenever it enters the battlefield, we can fetch for any plains card and put it onto the battlefield. Notice that it doesn't have to be a basic plains. That means we can ramp for Hallowed Fountain, Mistvale Plains, Prairie Stream, or Tundra, as well as any of the basic plains the deck does run. Another way of ramping in the deck is with Parallax Tide. I love this card, and I love it even more in this deck. It has Fading 5, so it enters the battlefield with 5 Fade counters. You can tap down up to 5 lands in order to get their mana. You can then remove that many Fade counters from Parallax Tide in order to delay exile them. Then, when Brago blinks the enchantment, its Leave the Battlefield trigger enter the Stax. When it resolves, those lands you exiled return to the battlefield untapped. Then, when it enters the battlefield, it gets 5 Fade counters again. Keep in mind though that you have to remove a Fade counter from it during your upkeep. Another thing I love about this card is that you can use it to exile lands during an opponent's upkeep step. Let's say for example your opponent has a Gaia's Cradle, Serra's Sanctum, Cabal Coffers, Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, etc. You can exile it during their upkeep step in order to deprive them of being able to use them during their main phase. Sure, the land will return to them when you blink Parallax Tide, but you'll be able to prevent them from taking full advantage of lands like that. You can also use it to exile lands like Maze of Ith and its ilk in order to prevent opponents from using it during combat. So far, I love using it on lands with Transform. Since the land is on the backside of the card, it returns to the battlefield face up to its front side. So that Idlamok, Sanctum of the Sun, Vault of Catlacan, etc. will be reset to their non-land forms. The salt is real when resetting these lands. You can also reuse lands with Palinchron. Whenever it enters the battlefield, you can untap up to 7 lands. You can also potentially generate infinite mana with it in a combo I'm going to discuss soon. Although you'd have to wait for combat to do these tricks, unlike with simply paying a morph cost, the deck does run other ways of blinking creatures. That way you are able to seemingly activate enter the battlefield effects. And the best card for this is in this deck, which is Eldrazi Displacer. For just 2 generic and 1 colorless, you can blink another target creature. This allows you to quote-unquote morph your manifested creatures as well as just straight up blink any of your other creatures. That way you can respond at instant speed with the control aspects of the deck, which we'll see in a moment. Additionally, you can also blink opponents' creatures, whether to remove them from combat, disrupt any of their plays, or to even do a favor to another opponent. Maybe that person has Acidic Slime in play, and the table needs to get rid of a pesky enchantment in play. You can strike a deal and blink it in order to get rid of said card. Although its ability can be activated at instant speed, Deadeye Navigator has to be soul bonded to a creature in order to blink it. That shouldn't be that big of an issue here, since you can simply have it blink itself to then get soul bonded to another creature in order to then blink that creature. It'll cost twice as much to do, but at least you'll be able to activate that enter the battlefield ability at instant speed for any creature. And if you soul bond it to Palinchron, you can potentially generate infinite mana. The way this works is by tapping down 7 lands which generate more than enough mana to pay for Deadeye Navigator's activation cost. Then, when Palinchron enters the battlefield, it untaps 7 lands. This gives you infinite mana. You can empty that infinite mana into Mastery of the Unseen. Then, once you've manifested your entire library, you can reset Deadeye Navigator's Soul Bond by blinking it and then Soul Bonding it to each manifested creature. This can basically cheat your entire deck into the battlefield, including lands. If Palinchron is too expensive, you can also pull this off with Great Whale or even Peregrine Drake, although the latter only untaps up to 5 lands. The reason I run Palinchron over Great Whale is because for the same mana cost, it has flying and a built-in self-bounce ability in case of emergencies. The deck does run Ancient Tomb and Temple of the False God, so being able to untap these lands can provide a ton of mana. Although it can't be done at instant speed, Venser the Sojourner's +2 ability can delay blink any permanent you own until the beginning of your next end step. Notice the wording. It's not any permanent you control, but any permanent you own. That means that if anyone were to steal anything from you, you'd get it back. This can also be used to take back control of coveted jewels should you lose it. Although not a key point to the deck, his ultimate is pretty oppressive if achieved. Every time we cast a spell, we can exile any permanent, which is the most ultimate form of removal. His second ability is also useful since he makes creatures unblockable. This allows you to attack with your army of manifested creatures, or any other creature for that matter, as well as Brago with almost total abandon. This is actually an important aspect of the deck, especially with Brago. Since Brago needs to connect in order for him to blink our things, he should be unblockable as often as possible. Sure, he has flying, but there might come a point in the game where every opponent has a blocker. This is when equipment like Whisper Silk Cloak becomes necessary. The cloak gives Brago some of the most important keywords for this deck, which is Shroud and Unblockable. Other ways to protect Brago include Swiftfoot Boots and Lightning Greaves. Although these don't grant Unblockable, they at least give haste. You can also make Brago unblockable with Thassa, God of the Sea, by paying 1 generic and 1 blue. Thassa has the added benefit of being indestructible, which helps her get harder to get rid of. Additionally, she has the bonus of scrying 1 each of our upkeeps. Another great way, albeit a bit costly, is making Brago unblockable with Rogue's Passage. Although it provides colorless mana, that's not a big deal in a 2-colored deck. But by paying 4 and tapping it, you can make Brago unblockable. However, perhaps one of the best ways to make Brago unblockable is Whirler Rogue. Not only does it create 2 flying blockers whenever it enters the battlefield, but by tapping down 2 artifacts, you can make any creature unblockable. Reading it carefully, you'll notice it's any creature, so you can also work together with someone else to make their creature unblockable when striking temporary alliances. And you guessed it, the 2 artifacts you can tap down are the Thopter tokens it creates. Talk about synergy. Alright, so now that we have a firm understanding of the philosophy and ins and outs of the deck, what exactly are we blinking? Well, I already mentioned the manifested cards, as well as the mana rocks and other ways to ramp. But what about control? How do we interact with opponents? This isn't a battlecruiser deck after all. Well, the deck includes plenty of ways to control the board as well as disrupt opponents via tempo loss or straight up removal. Aether Adept, Rift Ring Cloud Skate, Venser Shaper Savant, Reflector Mage, and Jace the Mind Sculptor return things to their owner's hands. Venser is great because it doesn't just bounce permanents. You can also bounce spells on the stack to their owner's hands, meaning that if you have enough mana and Venser is soul bonded to Deadeye Navigator, you can prevent players from successfully casting anything you don't like, even spells that can't be countered. With enough mana, you can also use Venser or Rift Ring Cloudskate to return a bunch of lands to opponents' hands when soul bonded with Deadeye Navigator. That's a very brutal and tempo loss. Reflector Mage is great in that the creature bounce can't be recast next turn, but with the way it's worded, if you were to target a creature commander and its controller chooses to send it to the command zone instead, they still can't cast it because of the name clause. So even though it becomes a different instant of the target, the fact remains that the name is the same. Aether Adept and Jace the Mind Sculptor are at least relatively cheap to cast as well and can get rid of a creature in a pinch, especially those indestructible ones. Nevermaker has a similar effect, but it's even worse for opponents since we're also taking away their next draw. Nevermaker also bypasses cards like Hushbringer since its ability isn't an enter the battlefield trigger, it's a leaves the battlefield trigger. So when it does, it tops deck's target non-land permanent. Done every turn, you can essentially lock a player out from drawing anything other than what you're sending to the top of their library. However, the best bouncer of all is Cataract Leviathan. This Get Wrecked Leviathan is a global cyclonic rift on a body. Sure, it bounces back all our non-land permanents too, but is itself a permanent. So that means that it can be manifested in order to be cheated into play when needed. It can also be flashed with Leyline of Anticipation, Vedalken Ori, or Winding Canyons. What's great about this creature is that it can also help us reset. If we have enough mana after casting it, we can recast mana rocks and build our board back before our opponents can. What's important about this Leviathan is that it helps when we become the arch enemy. We're not going to have responses to absolutely everything, including getting ganged up on. So it's a great reset because it gets rid of tokens, planeswalkers, enchantments, etc. Oh, and it stays behind afterwards. It's just a good substitute for Cyclonic Rift, all things considering. However, it's not too common for us to get too overwhelmed by opponents' board states since we are working to keep them in check. Besides bouncing things, we can just straight up get rid of them. The deck runs Spine of Ishsa and Cavalier of Dawn to destroy a permanent when entering the battlefield, although the Cavalier can only destroy a non-land permanent in exchange for giving its controller a 3/3 golem. Duplicant can exile a creature while potentially obtaining its power, toughness, and creature types. The Wanderer might not have any inherent way of increasing her loyalty, but at least by blinking her, we can consistently use her loyalty ability each turn to exile a creature with power 4 or greater. Luminate Primordial also exiles creatures, but it can exile up to 1 creature per opponent, which is great. Active Authority can exile an artifact or enchantment. Since we can blink it with Brago, it's best not to use its upkeep triggered ability and instead reuse it via blinking. Deputy of Detention and Detention Sphere are practically the same card except for super types. They exile any non-land permanent while they're on the battlefield. Since they exile everything with the same name, you can also get rid of all tokens, or if you're lucky, opponents having the same cards will also all get exiled. The same can be said for Consulate Crackdown, but that enchantment is crazy since it exiles all artifacts opponents control. Then, if they were to play any artifacts afterwards, blinking it will just have it re-exile the ones it did before, as well as any new ones. This can really slow down opponents since artifact-based ramp is a common occurrence in Commander games. Parallax Wave is the same as Parallax Tide, except it exiles creatures instead of lands. This can be used in a similar fashion as well. You can exile creatures in response to attacks or blocks. They might return when the enchantment leaves the battlefield, but having those fading counters on it really helps keep creatures in check. Another great way to get rid of things is by simply stealing them. Treachery is crazy good in this deck. Not only does it pay for itself since it untaps 5 lands when it enters the battlefield, but when you blink it, you can steal a different creature when it enters the battlefield. Oh, and it's going to untap up to 5 lands when it does too. This is great mana acceleration as well as removal. In a similar spirit are cards like Darksteel Mutation and Imprisoned in the Moon. I love these cards since it makes it really difficult for your opponents to work around them if you use them to transform their commander. Darksteel Mutation makes the creature indestructible, so attacking or blocking with it, dealing it damage, etc. won't kill it, so it won't return to the command zone. So unless it's tucked, blinked, bounced, or sacrificed, you've deprived them of their commander. Even better than that is Imprisoned in the Moon. Their commander becomes a colorless mana-producing land, so unless someone literally destroyed their land or they sacrifice it, it stays a land. Of course, they can just get rid of these enchantments, but enchantments are very difficult to get rid of if your color identity doesn't have a lot of support for it. However, my favorite piece of removal in the deck is Reality Acid. Thanks to the way it's worded, when we blink it, it leaves the battlefield. So the owner of the permanent it was enchanted has to sacrifice it. This bypasses everything except Shroud and Hexproof. It can also be done to any permanent, so you could also potentially wipe someone's entire board of everything, including lands. And in order to bypass Shroud and Hexproof, I'm running Arcane Lighthouse and Detection Tower. That way we can make sure to target what needs to be targeted. And again, since it's a 2-color deck, you have the luxury of being able to run a couple of colorless man bases. Apart from removal effects, the deck does contain some control elements as well. Azor the Lawbringer, Lavinia of the 10th, and Stonehorn Dignitary have some pretty oppressive effects when they enter the battlefield. Whenever Azor enters the battlefield, your opponents can't play any instants or sorceries during their next turn. If you're able to consistently blink him every turn, then your opponents would basically only be able to play instants during other players' turns. Additionally, he can also basically Sphinx's Revelation when you attack with him, which is nothing to scoff at. Lavinia detains each non-land permanent you don't control of converted mana cost 4 or less. This not only prevents opponents from activating most mana rocks they might have, but they won't be able to chump block with weak creatures nor attack and block with tokens, etc. Doing this each turn can really hinder your opponent's progress. Finally, Stonehorn Dignitary pretty much takes an opponent's combat phase away. If you're facing an aggro or even a mid-range player and you take away their combat phase, you've pretty much taken away their win con. Other control aspects of the deck include taxing effects such as Mystic Remora. Since we can blink it with Brago, we'd only ever have to pay its cumulative upkeep once since it'd always be resetting. This will almost always guarantee us a card draw whenever anyone plays a non-creature spell. Another cumulative upkeep enchantment in the deck is Tidal Control. Another oldie and a goodie, like Mystic Remora, this card can really crush some opponents. Since our deck doesn't run green or red, it won't affect us. Not only that, but any player can use this. So if there's a red spell on the stack that no one wants to resolve, anyone can pay 2 generic or 2 life. That's right, this enchantment is even better since you can pay life to counter red or green spells. Sure, it has a cumulative upkeep of 2 generic mana. So what? Blinking it removes its time counters. That means that the most we'd probably be spending on it is 2 generic mana each turn. Keep in mind that you don't want to run Painter's Servant with this card because then your cards are also going to be red or green and then people can counter them. On the topic of countering spells with the deck, I also run Glen Elendra Archmage. Although limited to non-creature spells, it only costs 1 blue and sacrificing itself to do so. It has Persist, so it returns to the battlefield afterwards. Fortunately for us, blinking it gets rid of that -1/-1 counter, so it can continue using its abilities more often than designed. Azorius Guildmage is used to counter activated abilities. This kind of counter effect is greatly underestimated and gravely underused. This ability can counter Planeswalker abilities as well as any other activated ability that can be bothersome. As a bonus, you can also use it to tap down creatures. That helps during combat in order to tap down a potential blocker for Brago or a potential attacker that might come our way. However, the worst culprit of all, the card that most salt extracts, is Stasis. This card is so oppressive in the deck that I don't cast it unless I'm in a pod that can handle it. Playing this card when everyone's mostly tapped out is a very back-breaking endeavor, especially since Brago allows us to reset our board by untapping all of our non-land permanents when they return from blinking. Our mana rocks can be used to pay for its upkeep trigger cost. Additionally, we have ways of untapping lands by direct and indirect methods. But if we deprive our opponents of their untapped steps while also bouncing things to their hand or exiling them, tucking them, destroying them, etc., it's really hard to bounce back from that unless their deck is resilient. Very few decks are resilient to such an oppressive card. So again, read the room and use the social contract when playing Stasis. As a reminder, Unwinding Clock will not work with Stasis because no one has an untapped step. As well as being the bane of our opponent's existence, the deck does abuse Enter the Battlefield triggers for our own benefit as well. Cloud Blazer and Mole Drifter draws us cards. Both are flyers, which also makes them great beaters as well as chump blockers in a pinch. Cloud Blazer has the added bonus of granting us 2 life when it enters the battlefield. Since it's possible to draw into many cards with this deck, I'm running Reliquary Tower as a way to double up on not having to discard anything during my cleanup phase. Clever Impersonator is the Swiss Army knife of the deck. The way it's worded means that when it enters the battlefield as a copy of any non-land permanent, it still triggers any enter the battlefield abilities of whatever it's cloning. What I love about it is that it can copy not just any key artifact, creature, or enchantment of ours, but any amazing non-land permanent an opponent controls, whether it's a planeswalker, creature, etc. Then, if there's something better to copy, we can blink it into something new. Other amazing support cards in the deck include Panharmonicon and Strionic Resonator. Panharmonicon doubles the triggers of creatures and artifacts entering the battlefield, which is ridiculous in the deck. We might not be able to double triggers of enchantments, but that's fine. Strionic Resonator is similar in that we can pay 2 and tap it in order to copy any triggered ability. Although mostly used to trigger Brago's triggered ability, it can be used to copy any of our own triggered abilities. I'm not running any double strike equipment or enchantments in the deck, but you can if you want to. Giving double strike to Brago basically doubles his ability. That's beyond crazy. However, since these equipments and artifacts don't really work with any other creature in my deck, I've chosen to omit them. But again, if you want to, you can include them and they'd be great. The rest of the deck are the lands. The deck is running the following double color lands: a Darkar Waste, Glacial Fortress, Nimbus Maze, and Sea of Clouds, as well as the aforementioned Hallowed Fountain, Prairie Stream, and Tundra. The deck runs all 8 fetch lands and 6 of each basic land to round out the mana base, as well as all the other lands mentioned throughout this video. As with my other videos, almost all of the budget for the deck is in the mana base. But you don't have to run all the Moxen, Mana Crypt, Tundra, and the fetch lands. You can just as well run cheaper 2-costed Mana Rocks and basic lands, and the deck will run just fine. Remember that you can run Peregrine Drake instead of Palancron. You can also swap out Jace for Dovin Hand of Control to bother opponents even more. Every other card in the deck is reasonably costed, so if you like this idea, you can work on it with a budget, maybe not as tight a budget, but still within reasonable budget. Although Brago King Eternal is essentially going to command a Blink deck, this brew is just an idea of how to build around him. Remember that it is a bit on the kooky side with the Manifest and Flash shenanigans, as well as the lack of instants and sorceries. However, keep in mind that you don't need to build it exactly as I have, so you could add instants and sorceries to yours. That being said, this deck is a lot of fun to pilot, and although opponents might predict some plays, a lot of them are still going to be surprises thanks to the Flash and Manifest. If you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the brewers, for their patronage. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and happy brewing.